Hey everyone, you're listening to Oye, Let's Talk with Gabby, Danny, and Manny. But today we're doing things a little bit differently. As you've all seen during national headlines, you may have seen it all over the news, the protests regarding justice for George Floyd and extension of the Black Lives Matter movement. Today we have a special guest to dive deeper in this topic, specifically within our community as well, Vanessa Santana.
Hey guys, how are you? Thank you so much for having me on here. I'll give a brief little intro. So, my name is Vanessa Santana. I am first generation Afro-Dominican. So, first in my entire extended family to be born in the United States. My entire family is from Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. And I recently relocated from New York City to Minneapolis, Minnesota. So, I live here, work as a marketer, and have been pretty involved, in the community, in the front lines, trying to protest as much as possible, since obviously the situation has happened here in the heart of everything. And yeah, I'm excited to share my experience as an Afro-Latina, and I'm excited to be on here. So thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Thanks
thanks
so
for
much
joining
for being here. We're clearly super excited that you're here.
us.
So I'll give a quick, brief summary of the New York Times on George Floyd, just to give a little background on what has recently sparked the Black Lives Matter movement once again. So on May 25th, for those of you who don't know, Minneapolis police officers arrested George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, after a convenience store employee called 911 and told the police that Mr. Floyd had bought cigarettes with a counterfeit $20 bill. 17 minutes after the first squad car arrived at the scene, Mr. Floyd was unconscious and pinned beneath three police officers, showing no signs of life. So, Vanessa, you mentioned that you live currently in Minneapolis. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen, if you've been a part of any of these protests?
Yeah, for sure. So, definitely, I think it's, again, I want to say that I'm definitely an expert in my own experience and a witness in others. So, I can speak just based on what I've seen, what the city has felt from my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the past couple weeks, especially the day of, just was super traumatic. You can feel the energy in the city was down, because the reality is he was murdered. It wasn't that he died at police custody. And, I think it's important that we're so intentional with the language that we use to describe these situations, because he was murdered, right? And unjustly, it was caught on video for the world to see. And I would say the first couple days, there was protests immediately starting the day after. And it was pretty much like everywhere throughout the city. So I actually live about 10 minutes away from where all this happened.
Wow.
And so I remember on that Thursday going for a walk at a lake nearby, just because it had been a pretty traumatic past couple of days, and walking right into a protest. So a protest that was happening, a peaceful protest near Lake Street by a famous lake out here. And quite frankly, that first protest that I had gone to and kind of walked into was super peaceful. So it was, people blocking traffic, yes, but people kneeling and praying in the middle of the street, for our nation, for our city, for George Floyd, for his family. There was people of all races, white people, Asian people, Latino people, young people, older people. There was just such a diversity of people. And I knew at that moment that I needed to start, posting these things on Instagram, because the response I was getting from back home and from my friends elsewhere in the country was, we're seeing all this unrest. We're seeing tear gas and police, and the National Guard is coming soon. And there was, the riots and the looting, and there was all this, I think, depiction that the media was bringing that wasn't necessarily what I was seeing being here in the city. So every single protest that I have been to has been pacific and peaceful. And it's just been a beautiful thing to see so many people come together, but also an equally sad, traumatizing time, because this had to happen for us to finally realize that Black Lives Matter. And this has been continuously happening. So I think for a lot of Black people, this wasn't new. We're used to seeing Black bodies killed at the hands of the police. Even now, it's been a couple of weeks since, and the city is still rebuilding. People are still coming together. So I think it's a dichotomy where you see a lot of positivity and people coming together, allyship. While it started in Minneapolis, this situation is not new, right? We know that. And I think the reason why this movement is picking up is because we are also in the middle of a pandemic with COVID-19, and people don't have the option to just turn a blind eye. They're not so busy that they can just continue moving forward with their lives. We're all seeing it. It all started in this city. And so now people are activated to actually change the injustices that have been going on for so long.
I think another key component here is that, because you mentioned that it's not anything new. This has been happening, since the beginning of our American history. I think nowadays, and by nowadays, I mean the 21st century, we're able to record things. Whereas before it wasn't documented. You couldn't see a video. There was no proof. Now you do have that proof. And, there are some things that are just inevitably right or wrong. There is no in between. There's no maybe. It's yes, it happened, or no, it did not happen. Look at the proof.
Right. But even, I agree 1,000%. I think technology has enabled the ability to have that evidence and proof. I think what's even more sad is that even with those video recordings, you still have people who are looking for all the, what's the track record? What's the criminal record? Or what, maybe they were resisting arrest. There's even with all this video footage, we still have people trying to build a case. And I think that's super problematic. But yeah, I'm super grateful that, imagine that's also the part, again, that's equally a little bit traumatic, because you think about, what about all the cases where people didn't record,
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. Vanessa, I wanted to ask you, when you were out in the protests, was there anything that you saw, like a poster, or is anything that you heard that really resonated with you, that really kind of changed how you were thinking in the moment?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot. So I think people are so creative. It's been very interesting to see, just the communication that people and the expression people have when they go to the protests. I think for me, what has been very impactful is seeing the way people at protests talk about white silence being betrayal and white silence being violence. And again, you have to remember, I'm in Minnesota, which is not, my new home, but I'm from New York City, where I'm used to being around a lot of diversity. And so being in Minneapolis, while it is diverse, there is a lot of white people here. So seeing white people actually step up and say, white silence is violence, or white silence is betrayal, and no longer can I be silent. That has been very interesting to me, because, again, we're having an awakening where a lot of white people, including Latinos, like white passing Latinos, or even other races, are starting to realize how problematic the situation is. And I think that has been eye-opening for me. And yeah, I will say also, I've liked seeing the celebration of certain things too, like how I saw a poster that said, Black joy is an act of resistance. And I thought about that as well, of how, Black lives matter. That's the minimum. We're not supposed to just matter. We're also worthy. We're supposed to thrive and be happy. And even those things can be seen as negative in the very polarized society that we're living in right now. But I think those messages have been very uplifting for me personally.
Thank you for sharing.
Of course.
Talk a little bit about the whole concept of, well, yeah, but all lives matter. Why is that problematic to someone who insists on that but doesn't understand?
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting that we're even having this discussion, right, as a society. And, for me personally, I guess I'll share an anecdote. I have an aunt that is white passing Dominican, and, she was reaching out to me about the protest and being like, why are you there? You shouldn't be there. Quédate en la casa, que están tirando, y esto y lo otro. It was a lot. And, she started talking to me with the all lives matter rhetoric and, well, all lives matter. And, I had to give her the analogy and say, okay, well, if you're on the street and one house is burning, are you going to call the firefighters and tell them to, hose down every other house on the block?
Mm-hmm.
No, you're going to tell them to hose down the house that's burning, right?
Right.
And that's the same thing with all lives matter rhetoric. It's like the reason why people are saying Black Lives Matter is because Black lives are dying, okay? And like Black lives have been suppressed. And that's not only just in this country, that's globally. Like that's in our countries as well. And I think when people use that rhetoric of all lives matter, there just needs to be a lot of introspection of like, why do you feel so offended that Black lives should matter? Because all lives cannot matter until Black lives matter. And Black lives are the ones being killed and suppressed consistently.
Let me ask you if you can share, what did your aunt say? How did that conversation go? Because I feel like that's a conversation that a lot of people may want to have with their friends who are white or their family members who are white or white passing. How did that conversation go? What are some tips or advice that you can give to our listeners who may want to start that dialogue with someone?
Right. No, absolutely. So I will say the conversation for me was very hard, right? Because it's my tia, she's somebody who I love and someone who loves me. But the truth is, as a white passing Latina, she will never have to experience some of the things that me, my mom, my brother will have experienced. And so when she was using this rhetoric, I had to, it was very exhausting, quite frankly, to have the conversation, especially being as, self-identifying as a Black person. But I had to just straight up give her examples of times that I had encountered racism and times that I had, a Karen call the cops on me and my friends for just having a party.
Wow.
So I had to like really go in detail. I had to talk about times where my little brother will be pulled over. And, my aunt is like, no, porque tú eres cristiana y tú, you're so successful and you're the model in the family and this and this and that. And I'm like, okay, tia, but at the end of the day, when a cop sees me, they're not saying, oh, okay, Vanessa, she could be Dominican and she could be Christian and she could be super successful. They're not saying all these things. They're just seeing my skin for what it is, right? And so I think the minute you make it personal to your family members, if you are an Afro-Latina, that's when it becomes real, because they see you, like your family members see you as a person and they see you for who you are. And I think that idea of Blackness sometimes in our culture and Latino culture is ignored, or colorism is just belittled. And I think in terms of tips, even if it's like a white passing Latino talking to another family member that doesn't understand, I think it's thinking about those people in your life and in your family that could very well be affected, and using them as an example of like, this could be them. Because I think the people don't get things until you make it personal. And that's one thing. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I think is analyzing the history of racism within our own culture, and honestly doing a lot of learning and reflection on that. Because I think, especially for me and my family, race wasn't something that we often talked about. My parents were immigrants. Even when I came here, like people here in the States, they think I'm Black, but the reality is I grew up eating arroz con habichuela, and I had a very interesting experience. I had a very Dominican experience. Right. I had a very Dominican upbringing. But again, at face value, people say, okay, you're Black. So imagine as a first generation person having to navigate like what I'm being told I am, what I think I am, what I look like, but what my family says I am. It's a lot at once. And so I think we need to start having real conversations about racism and colorism in our own culture as Latinos. And that is something that I think is a good starting place for when you're having these conversations, is analyzing and saying, okay, that stubborn maybe tia or that grandpa or whoever, my abuelo, it's like, okay, how about we pay attention to who they're casting in the novelas? How about we pay attention to what artists get famous and why? How about we pay attention to, who's in a Latin Grammy and why? And, like those are the type of things we need to start doing introspection and reflection on, is like how colorism and racism manifests itself in our own countries. And then, because I think that's when you start to learn and unpack that, you can then start to better understand that it's not just an American issue. Because I think that's the tough part too, is that I've been in conversations with family members where they're like, oh yeah, well, you feel it because you're American. And I'm like, no, because this could very well be you as well, because you're also Black. And so again, I think it's just an education thing. I think it's an empathy thing. And just coming at it with an open mind, but also being relentless in trying to prove why, fellow Black Lives Matter. And also how Latinos have faced discrimination here as well. So
actually, Vanessa, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted to touch upon that because this is like a twofold question. One, I've been educating a lot of my colleagues, explaining like you're going to have tough conversations with your parents or people of other generation that may be white passing Latinos. Understand that the first time you may bring it up, or the first 3 times, like how do you navigate understanding that they're not going to understand the first time? And then the second part of my question is, well, then I get a lot of, well, what about Latinos? Like, why don't you worry about our oppression? So what tips would you have for our listeners to navigate those two situations?
Yeah. So regarding the first one, and you said, repeat the first question again. I just want to make sure I answer it correctly.
So essentially, you got up the courage, you decided to tell your white passing Cuban grandmother that, hey, what you're saying is not okay, or what you said there was a little racist. And you brought up all the education and everything you spent time learning. You were trying to explain to your grandmother, but it ends in a fight. What would you do at that point?
I think it's tough, again, because the colorism is so deep rooted in our cultures. But I think it's, again, the best thing is making things personal. So like thinking about those Black people in your life and in your family, or people that or friends or whatever that the case may be, and making it an example about them. Like it could very well be this person and this is why. Or, showing the countless times. And I think another thing too that I've noticed within the Latino community, or at least within my family, I would say a lot of times the conversation gets construed and people start talking about the violence and the looting and the riots. And I think the important thing is to refocus on what's important. So in those conversations that you're having with people who don't necessarily understand, it's like, it might have to be a history lesson, a tough history lesson where you're literally just teaching them what happened before and why. And I think it's just patience. And the reality is also understanding, like, we as humans can't change people. People change on their own terms and when they want to change. So I think, for me, like I said, in my family, I've spoken from my own personal experience. I've made examples of other Black people in my family. And when you make it personal, people can't refute or argue that. So I think that's, as much as you can, making it personal, making it about someone in your life, in your family.
That emotional appeal.
That's what makes the difference. And it's not an easy thing, but it's the right thing. And then I think your second question was regarding like when people are like, what about Latinos?
Right? That a lot of the times they try to change the discussion, or as you were saying earlier, like we may struggle to refocus why we're speaking about the Black Lives Matter movement. But a lot of Latinos, I think, find safety in saying, well, what about our oppression, or what about us? And how do we navigate that situation to say your point or your feelings towards your oppression are valid, but we need to refocus right now?
Yeah. I think plain and simple, it's not the same oppression. It's not the same oppression. Like, this country was built off, like, the United States was legitimately built off of slavery and capitalism. And so the oppression of Black people in this country is a different plight. Not to say, the Latino oppression isn't equally awful, or like the immigration crisis that we're seeing, or families being detained. Like, not to say that those things are not awful, because they are. Being killed by the cops by merely existing is not the same. You know what I'm saying? And I think that is the conversation we need to have empathy for, because, and I think the minute that our communities unite and there's not so much divisiveness within the Black Latino cultures, because the cultures are so similar, like the value systems are so similar. I again think that we have just been conditioned as Latinos to not want to associate with Black people in this country because of all the stereotypes that come with that, right? So we choose to separate ourselves, when in reality, we need to be focusing on how to unify, because our struggles are still similar as well, and our own countries have all dealt with colonization and white supremacy. And those are things that both groups have been oppressed. But right now, the situation that is uprising is Black Lives Matter, because they keep dying at the hands of police. And that is a systematic issue that has existed for years that we can't just turn a blind eye to. And yes, there will continue to be struggles within the Latino community, but it's all the same source. It's all, systematic oppression, white supremacy. They're all from the same source. So the minute we start to understand where the source is, that's when we can start to move forward and to empathize.
I think another big problem that we're seeing, and this has come up with like conversations with friends of friends, is the fact that I think a lot of people are like, well, I understand it, but it's not my issue, or it's not in me to say anything because I'm not Black, or I can't identify, I shouldn't, speak for them because this isn't my cause. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Whether they're ignorant or not, they just don't identify, or they don't feel like it's their duty, so to speak. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, I would say this is not a situation of Black and white. This is not a situation of politics. This is a human issue. Mm-hmm. This is purely a human issue. You don't have to be Black, white, Latino, Asian, or anything to see someone murdered unjustly and know that that is wrong. Like, it's basic humanity 101. So like, how many times again do we have to, and you don't have to be Black or white to know that it's wrong. Mm-hmm. And therefore, you don't have to be, you have to be uncomfortable with remaining silent. I think silence is, again, betrayal, and it's hurtful, it's painful. And I think it needs to be addressed. And it's like, you should be speaking up because it's a human issue. It's not a race issue. It's a human issue with the maltreatment that happens to do with race.
Vanessa, you bring up such a great point. This is a human issue. This is an issue that stands at the forefront of Black people's liberties. Compared to when the Black Lives Matter movement first started over 7 years ago, I can't help but notice the difference in tone. There's a difference in the air. We're seeing protests pop up in all 50 states. We're even seeing protests in other countries. The movement has a different magnitude to it. It feels powerful. How does this moment compare to 7 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the issue isn't different. Like, people were still getting murdered.
Oh, definitely. Right.
But the sense of the sense of the movement, yes, I would say that it has evolved. And I think a lot of that, to my earlier point, is because of this global pandemic that we're in with COVID-19 and how everyone has been, at home, and our world has just drastically shifted to a point where we don't have a choice to just ignore it, because all of these things are being widespread, publicized, and the whole world saw a man get murdered. You know what I'm saying? And it's like maybe earlier, people were in their own lanes and just kind of moving. But now what we have in this earth is just a unifying force of this pandemic and everyone going through it their own way. And I think this has caused a lot of people to do that internal reflection and also see that it's wrong, you know? And I think I have been really inspired by the momentum of this movement globally as well. Like all the countries that you're seeing pour out, you're seeing even more Latino countries now. Like I saw recently a whole entire campaign in Colombia for a man that was murdered by police brutality. And things like that are really crazy because you realize again that it's not a US issue, it is a global issue. And so yeah, I think I'm hopeful that the movement will continue to spark change.
Vanessa, I actually had a question that I wanted to get your perspective on. So
Sure.
some of the conversations that I've been seeing is that, oh, this movement has died down a bit because we're seeing it less on social media, fewer protests are being planned, et cetera, et cetera. Or one comment I recently scrolled past was, oh, I believe they finally got the change they were protesting for. And that really didn't sit right with me. Although these protests have been sparking some sort of change, like I was just wondering, what change have you seen on your end and what change do you still hope to see?
Yeah. That's good. I mean, I think so in terms of changes that I've seen locally, obviously like the police officers getting arrested, certain states passing specific laws that go against police reform. People have been like for example in Minnesota, you have a couple of like the Minnesota Public Schools, Parks and Recreation, like all these major agencies are defunding or closing all their ties with the Minneapolis Police Department. I think that is huge, right? Like when you start to see other businesses or other entities cutting ties with the police and showing that they believe in community-led safety, and they believe in investing resources back into the community. Those type of things I think are significant changes that came because of the protests, right? Because people are going out there every day demanding change and demanding justice. So those are great changes that I've seen locally here. There's a ton that we could probably go on a list that have happened over the past 2 weeks. But I think this is just the surface. This is just the beginning. There's just so many systematic issues, everything from like education and health reform. Like there's just a list of so many issues to tackle that I don't think it's going to take, after our lifetimes to even see those things fully resolved. So I think this is just the beginning. I'm hoping it continues, but I don't think it's something that's going to happen overnight by any means.
I agree.
And I'm sorry to agree.
Right. I was actually going to
That's
ask you guys the
part.
question, if that's cool.
Yeah.
Go on, Vanessa.
Yeah, I said I was going to ask you guys the questions if that's cool too. Cause
Yeah,
go
ahead.
Obviously this is y'all podcast, so I'm not trying to steal the mic because I know I could be long-winded. I just am curious how you guys have been dealing with this personally or feeling about it, speaking out or not speaking out, and curious how you guys are dealing with it as Latinos who might not have that super strong tie to Blackness. I'm just curious how you guys are dealing with it.
So I actually want to touch upon like another layer to this. We're all also like in professional media where we need to be concerned about our credibility on which side, if there are sides to stand on things. And, we're obviously employed by various media companies. So
Sure.
we have to take that into account too, because I don't want to say we'll lose our jobs, but like it can be an uncomfortable conversation with a boss.
Oh yeah.
So just personally on my end, like I found that I didn't have too much trouble with that. Like it was interesting to navigate as a professional. because I'm very outspoken and I know how I want. But again, it's using the platforms I have to express factual beliefs, if that makes sense. Like I have the facts to prove these things. And I think that's a little bit of the angle that we've all taken is, you know, talking about the change, talking about the number of peaceful protests. I know personally on Twitter, like whenever I see misinformation, like call it out and linking the facts. Like at the end of the day, as journalists, like that's kind of the waters that we swim in. And then being the three of us, I would say, are white passing Latinos or lack of melanin, to be honest. So it's just making sure we have those conversations with our families. And, you know, we're in it 24/7. News is a 24/7 business. So we're always constantly surrounded by it, reporting the latest from Minneapolis, and then like whatever little changes and protests it may spark within our communities that we cover. And then having to have the difficult conversations or those interactions with maybe white colleagues and trying to explain to people or like overhear conversations and professionally, you know, navigate that, and then doing it with your loved ones. It can be exhausting overall, but it's a fight worth having at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I echo Gabby on that. Absolutely. I think that awareness is key when it comes to any type of controversial topic, any type of human rights theme, so to say. I think that our mission as journalists is always to inform, to shed light on topics that could be somewhat uncomfortable, like Gabby mentioned, more than anything, to encourage people to have these conversations, to go out and vote, to let them know that their voice does matter. Like they're one person, but collectively and united, regardless of what culture, what background you come from, we stand stronger. And any type of major movement that has, you know, crossed that tough barrier and made something of themselves is because they stood up for something and they did change the course of history. So I think we need to understand that we also have the power to change history. It's just a matter of taking action, even if it's just, you know, showing support and solidarity. And I'm not just talking about, you know, posting a Black image on Instagram, because I don't know how much really that does in the long term, but posting a link to, you know, donate to a particular Black organization, you know, showing resources that you can look into, how to educate yourself. I think that's very important.
The things I've asked you throughout this podcast are things that I've been going a lot through my head. How to have a dialogue with someone, because at the end of the day, that's how we're going to make change, you know, talking to someone, reaching out, whether it's your family, you were talking to your tia, or Gabby talking to her coworkers, you know, because at the end of the day, it just takes, you know, you changing someone's mind, and it's going to be, you know, that little effect that's going to create a ripple effect into, you know, the rest of our society. And I also asked you about how this movement now compares how it first started 7 years ago. And I'm really noticing a big shift in not only the intensity of the protesting going around the nation and just the length of it. Like this, it's been 2 weeks and there's still protests going on weekdays and weekends here in, you know, in South Florida, miles removed from Minneapolis. And you're also seeing a big shift from big corporations. You know, it may seem a little, you know, late or hypocritical, but it's still something to be noted. And I feel like the moment right now feels very different, and we're living in this, and there's a pandemic going around. And at the same time, what people I think are forgetting, it's an election year. And what I'm most hopeful for is that this energy drives people to the polls, and that we see some big major changes, and we see, you know, people with strong policies and, you know, strong reforms on police or gun reform. And that's what keeps me hopeful for the future, for the months to come. You know, a lot of it is unpredictable, and we can't, you know, change the world even within our lifetimes. Like you said, you know, we're only here to change it just a little tiny bit, because, you know, we stand on the shoulders of giants that have come before us, that have done so much. And I feel like here and the moment in our time, our role is to move the needle just a little more. If that means, it can be insignificant to us in the moment, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it's a lot. And I feel like that's what I've been going through, and just, having those hard conversations.
Very well said. I agree with literally everything, because at the root, I think you need all parts, right? Like you need all parts of the revolution in order to make change. Like you need the protest. You also need the legal reform, and getting people, like you said, keeping that same energy when it comes time to vote, not only, nationally, but also at the local level. And I'm just hoping that people can continue to, educate themselves, not only on racism, but also educate themselves on their local legislators and how they're a direct, impact to their society locally. So I'm excited for that too.
From like district attorneys, state attorneys, judgeships, which even, some counties have sheriffs. And I think all that creates just a little bit of change.
I just wanted to ask, how are you dealing with everything? Like, how are you handling it? I understand that social media might be hard to scroll through sometimes, or it may feel like an endless black hole. Like, I see you're having tough conversations with your parents and going out there and protesting. Like, what is it like for you, and how are you taking care of yourself?
Yeah, I think I'll be honest. I think it varies by the hour sometimes. I think for me, personally, I think the first week of all the George Floyd, so Ahmaud Arbery, that happened, and I would say for me it was very like numbing, almost like, okay, another situation. It
Did
was
you
very
watch the
numbing.
entire video by any chance?
Yeah, I watched every video. And for me, I have a 19-year-old brother. So every time I see these situations, I just can only think about my brother and how that could very well be my brother, how he's about to move to Arizona and he's about to be alone, because he's going to college. And it's just like that creates a lot of stress and anxiety, I think, for me. Which I'm typically a chill person. Like I'm pretty chill. I'm not super emotional. I'm pretty level set and balanced. But I think the George Floyd situation was, because it happened again 10 minutes away from where I live. It was tough. It was very tough. It was very hard to go into work the next day and act like everything was business as usual, or, I was very disengaged for that first week. I think it was super traumatic again, because all I can think of is my brother. And then you hear about Breonna Taylor and you're like, that could have been me, that could have been my friends. That could have been anybody. And I think when the George Floyd situation happened, the Amy Cooper situation happened as well. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of that one, where there was a white woman in Central Park who had called the cops on a bird watcher. And he caught her on video calling the cops and, pretty much putting on this whole show and over dramatizing, saying she was being attacked the whole time she's choking her dog. And that blew up all over social media. And, the woman lost her job. Now, I even saw New York is trying to pass a Amy Cooper bill that, addresses when people call the police like that. And that, to me, that triggered a lot, because like I said, I've had white women weaponize their whiteness and call the cops on me for no reason. Like, I've been in situations like that, and I think the culmination of everything was super traumatic the past couple weeks. But the thing is, I work in marketing, specifically doing social media content strategy and media buying. So I can't necessarily afford to like take a couple of days off social media and not look at it, because it's part of my everyday profession. So I think that, like all these images and all these things you're seeing on your feed, that all starts to really get to you, and it's pretty traumatic. And I think, that coupled with also having to deal with tough conversations with family members who didn't get it, or, have even just like an overwhelming response from a lot of like white people or allies who were finally realizing it. Even that was a little bit exhausting because I'm like, wow, you're finally realizing that racism is real, and how do I deal with your like white guilt right now? It's awkward. So I would say in terms of how I'm dealing with it, I think I went through my wave of like deep trauma and reflection and understanding and trigger. I was super triggered. Now I'm trying to channel that more into being a resource to others, to myself, and then obviously having to take care of myself. Like I said, it's been just going through waves of emotion. 1 minute you're like, oh my God, this could be my brother, this could be me. And then you're also dealing with your family members who might not get it. And then you're also dealing with work when trying to show up and still be you and still contribute, but also being, having to live this almost like a double life. But luckily, again, I'm very fortunate that I work with people who have been super supportive and understanding, and my company has been supportive. So I'm grateful for that, but it still doesn't change the fact that, you still have to like show up and be a functioning human. And so I think for self-care and what I've tried to do, I mean, I've had plenty of nights where I'm like, I'm just going to have comfort food and chill.
Treat yourself for sure.
Right.
I love that.
Yeah, I'm like, listen, I'm not even going to worry about eating this salad. I'm ordering a whole pizza and I'm going to feel fine. And then yeah.
I think it's also the internal realization also that it's like, it's not your job to educate people either.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great when they ask questions and when they come to you for advice. I think, that's great. But when it comes down to it, I think it's everyone's individual responsibility to go and do a quick Google search. I don't know, watch a Netflix documentary, read educated books about what it's like, what certain
Basically,
individuals have gone
Vanessa,
through.
she's saying you should eat your pizza, let the other people carry some weight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gabby.
Yeah, no, but it's like, the thing is, it's also
exhausting.
like, it's super exhausting. And even in our culture, like we're brought up, like Latinos are brought up to, you gotta like be nice, and you gotta, when people ask for help, you gotta break your back to help them. And so naturally, I think I am someone who, I don't want to just, reject people and be like, go Google it, so naturally
Right.
I like to help. And so what I've been doing is trying to use my platform on social media more as a place where I post resources, I post my thoughts and whatnot, and try to get, spread the knowledge and resources as much as I can. But yeah, it's been awkward having to deal with like people's, like white guilt, or like, hey, like, I know this is really wrong. And I'm like, okay, what do you want me to do about it? Do you want me to like, am I supposed to like applaud you for caring that I'm Black, or am I supposed to not, So it's been really interesting.
Time to seek attention. It's not the time.
Yeah, it's really interesting to like see other people realize all the things they've been missing out on. Like that's been very interesting, but also kind of equally exhausting, because then when you get these messages of people being like, "Oh my God, thinking of you, like how can I help?" It's like then it still puts the burden on people of color, on Black people, to have to respond, or something like that. So I think that's been very interesting to navigate. And I think for me, I've been again trying to channel my energy on what I can control. And I think, in terms of faith, for me has been so important too. Like every day, literally saying my Salmo 23 and like grounding myself in like my identity and faith, because I had to say it this morning, and it was so funny because I realized that I only know it in Spanish. I don't know it in English.
Yes.
But
I can relate.
always the struggle.
Yeah, I relate too.
But yeah, I was like, thanks, Graham. Abuela, man, abuela. I never thought I would like be leaning on my abuela's, words right now.
Okay, so this is not the question I was going to ask originally, but I want to really take the opportunity since you're here. And I want to ask, and it's not an easy question because I feel like it's not an easy answer. And I know it becomes exhaustive. Like we've been talking about it, where you're like, am I supposed to applaud you, or like, oh, congrats? But what do we do? And I feel like this is a question for all of us, but Vanessa, specifically for you, what happens to those people who don't want to change their minds, or who are too ignorant to realize that they're wrong? What do we do? Obviously it's none of our jobs to teach or reach out to those people, but do we just ignore those bigots? Do we continue moving and ignore the people that can't be changed? Because that's something I constantly try to think about, because at the end of the day, I feel like sometimes we live in an echo chamber, and, we're posting on our social media, and, most of our circle of friends are, they probably think the same as us. It's like, do you go ahead and unblock, or do you try to have a conversation with that person? Or are you like, no, this is not even worth my time? What's your opinion on that? I feel like I'm asking you, but it's like, that's such an exhausted, you're like already exhausted as it is, teaching someone who does want to reach out. How do you address that? What do you have to say on that?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. So I will answer. So for me, I feel like as a Black person, there are so many more fish to fry that I don't even have time to address the bigots, because at that point I've already classified you as like, you are part of the problem, and you're like that because you want to be like that, and that's how you were raised, and that's so for me it's like, I don't have the capacity to, but that's when I think allies and people who are not necessarily going through the trauma in the same way, I think that's when your allyship is so important. Because to me, the role of white people, white passing Latinos, Asians, the role of non-Black people is to have those conversations on our behalf, because you are enlightened, and you have that perspective, and you have that connection, and you have the ability and power to change someone's mind like that because of a personal relationship. I'm not talking about the trolls on Twitter. That the trolls on Twitter and the trolls on social media that just go in there and have hate. It's no point in time in trying to change somebody's mind that way, because people would just argue to death on the internet. But if it's somebody that you actually value and care for in your personal life, I believe it is your fundamental role as a non-Black person to be trying to tap through. However, understanding that people and humans, we do not have the power to fully change. We can influence, but we cannot change people. People change when they want to change on their own terms. So
that is so true.
You're so right.
So yeah, I think it's just remembering your power as an ally is to educate, is to have those tough conversations. Because I guarantee you, Manny, if you're talking, Manny, Gabby, Danny, if you guys are talking to one of these bigots that you just, I'm making this up, but maybe it's somebody that you work with, and they, I don't know them and I don't see them. I don't have a reason to talk to them, and I don't have a reason to like waste my time trying to convince them. But if it's somebody that you value and that you constantly make exchanges with, I think it's worth the conversation, knowing that we need to be very clear that us as people, we can only influence so much. We don't have the power. We're not God. Like, we don't have the power to change somebody's heart and spirit. And that has to be on God. You just got to have the conversation and influence what you can, and pray that it falls on good soil and that God will change that person, to be honest. That's my answer.
Honestly, Vanessa,
Well
I love
said.
that answer. Yes, that was beautiful. Like I've honestly, since throughout the past few weeks, like that's something I've constantly been, questioning in my head, and I feel like you've addressed it, beautifully. You're like, allyship is so important. You're so right. You're so right. Thank you for that.
Of course, and the biggest will continue. Like that's why the world is the way it is. Like that's why this earth is the way it is, and unfortunately, we can't change everyone, because there can't be a revolution without opposers. So
true. Wow. So many great
quotes.
As a journalist, I would love to just grab and write.
Like, I literally want to slap some of her words on a cute Instagram post and be like, repost.
Amazing.
Yes.
I'm here for it.
Anything else, Vanessa, that you would like to add?
if I can say anything, it's especially if you guys, again, are focused on Latino voices and Latinos, like, this is not a Black issue, y'all. Like, this is a human issue. And I think we need to all do homework on how, you know, racism manifests itself in our own culture. And I think that, again, I applaud and thank you guys for having me on here. Cause like I said, I'm an expert in my own experience, but a witness in others. And I can tell you that sometimes some of my most racist experiences have been with my own people, with other Latinos. So I think we need to all collectively like do homework on what is it like, why is our culture rooted the way it is? And a lot of that has to do with colonialism. But again, what can we be doing differently internally as a culture? Because we are the most powerful, vibrant, and dynamic people there are, like, period. Latinos are so dynamic. And I was talking to Danny, I think yesterday, when we were saying, you know, like, she was saying how sometimes she doesn't fit the Latina mold. And we were talking about this concept of the Latino mold. There is no mold because we're all so dynamic. We're so multifaceted. You go to our countries, you see Black, you see white, you see, you know, skinny, you see big, you see curvy. You see Latinos are so dynamic. There's not one way. And I think that that's something that we need to start celebrating. Because
amen, sister friend.
Yeah, so we need to start celebrating, we need to start educating, we need to stand. Now is the time for us to speak up, for our Afro-Latino community, for our Black community. And yeah, solidarity is important, but activism is even more important. And, you know, allyship is a verb. It's not just a little Instagram post. It's you actively trying to learn and educate yourself and influence those around you. So that's what I would say, is just we have to, you know, have these tough conversations in our families, in our workplaces, with ourselves. We have to analyze our own behaviors and what has been imposed on us. And I think the minute we do that, and I think I'm hopeful that our generation is going to be the ones to do it. And yeah, pa'lante.
Just so you know, Vanessa, we wanted this podcast, we wanted to focus on you and your experiences. Allow you, since none of us are Black, none of us have those experiences, allow you, you know, to voice that.
And specifically as an Afro-Latina.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you guys again for having that, because I think it's like, yeah, we have moved culture for so long and we've been silenced for so long, but I'm so happy to see, you know, more and more Afro-Latina and Afro-Latino voices, because again, this is so important, and we're all equally Latino and equally Black. So, you know, I don't think it's like a one or the other. When I think about my own identity, I'm like, I'm equally Latina and I'm equally Black, and I'm not mixed. I'm Afro-Latina because, like I said, I'm culturally Hispanic and racially Black. And I think, again, I was saying this yesterday, how I think the thing is, people oftentimes, it doesn't sit well with people to not be able to point at one thing and classify you as one thing. And I think that's the tough piece, is that when you're so dynamic and multifaceted, or you have a lot of layers, people are like, oh, what do I do with that? So again, I'm excited by this platform and what you guys have created. And like I said, I think our generation is going to be the one to change the narrative of not only our own cultures, but the culture of this world. So thanks again for having me.
And thank you so much again, Vanessa, for joining. So key takeaway, everyone, remember just to ask people to lean in and to say, oye, let's talk about what's happening in the world right now. Thanks again, Vanessa. Thank you, Danny and Manny. And I hope you all stay tuned for our next episode of Oye, Let's Talk.